Hi, this is photosynthesis, as you can tell from the very, very green picture here. This is Kim Foglia's PowerPoint from Explore Biology, narrated by Dr. Meade. So we spent a lot of time talking about cellular respiration, and now we're going to kind of talk about the other end of that, which is photosynthesis. And hopefully you're sort of getting to the point where you're a little bit just blown away by these complex processes happening so fast at the cellular level. I think after you get through photosynthesis and you kind of put it all together with, life on the planet is really all about these two processes. These are the essence of biology. This is the study of life at its most fundamental level. So hopefully, even though it's really complex to learn as a student, you can step back a little bit and just appreciate that scientists have been able to uncover so much detail about something that happens in such a small level. This is representing, hundreds of years of work to build such an understanding about what's happening. So, and remember that there's still a lot left to learn about these processes. There's still a lot about the structure and complexity of some of the proteins involved that we still really don't quite know. So there's a lot left to be studied, and that's being studied. And if you pursue science in college, you're going to start to hit those points where you can see the questions in the science that's still going on to answer some of these questions. So let's get started on photosynthesis. There we go. So photosynthesis is life from light and air, and I think that's a pretty awesome concept. All right. I was going to mute those this time. There we go. So, how do we harvest from air and light everything we need to make organic molecules? That's what we're going to be talking about. So, all of life needs a constant input of energy, of course. All right, and this is just a reminder about some basic vocabulary involved. So heterotrophs, animals. Heterotrophs, remember, are organisms that get their energy from eating others. So we, of course, are heterotrophs. As much as we might love standing out in the sun, we're certainly not going to be able to make carbohydrates while we're standing there, although that would be so handy, wouldn't it? So we eat food from other organisms so that we can break down and what we eat and harvest the organic molecules there. So that makes us a consumer, okay? So we make energy through respiration. So we eat something, we break it down into its components, and we use those components to generate ATP. And along with that, we're doing an exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide through our lungs and at the cellular level, of course. The opposite of that, autotrophs, the plants. Okay, it's not only plants, we're going to talk about the exceptions to that, but plants are the primary example. They produce their own energy, so it's from self, that's the auto part, and they're producers. So they convert the energy of the sun, okay, and build organic molecules, and they get the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, so they're going to be doing carbon fixation. They're going to be taking carbon out of the atmosphere and fixing it into molecules. And so organic molecules, of course, being made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So it's pretty awesome, okay? It's how we are, in essence, eating the sun. So the sun is the main driving force of life on the planet. So since we can't eat the sun, we are going to harvest the energy of the sun by eating others. Okay, so they make energy and synthesize sugars through photosynthesis. So the basic vocabulary, just to remind you that you need to know the difference between consumers and producers, and the difference between autotrophs and heterotrophs. okay, and organic molecules, notice, in both places. That's why we've talked about the organic molecules kind of first, leading up to this, so that we understand that the needs and the qualities of the organic molecules, the proteins, sugars, nucleic acids, and lipids. So it's not only sugars that we're going to be talking about. All right, so connecting the two, okay? We talk a lot about photosynthesis being respiration run backwards, that these two reactions are the same in the opposite order. All right, so heterotrophs are making energy in organic molecules from ingesting organic molecules, like we just talked about. All right, so this is, of course, the formula for cellular respiration. Glucose and oxygen become carbon dioxide, water, and ATP, and we talked about that in great detail. All right, so we oxidize the glucose and the fall of electrons downhill with the oxygen. So here's our oxidation, the exergonic reaction. All right, and autotrophs, okay, plants and a few other organisms making energy and organic molecules using light. All right, so if you notice, this is sort of the opposite of the cellular respiration reaction. So we do expect you to have both of these formulas memorized. So if you need to write them down again, this is a good place to pause and make sure you've got that down. All right, so in this, we're doing a reduction. We're reducing, okay, and producing oxygen. So we're boosting electrons uphill, and we're going to split water. And this is an endergonic reaction, okay? So this is reduction and endergonic. And respiration has this major oxidation feature, and it's exergonic. So again, take a moment, pause, and get all this down. So the penguin's going to ask a question here, okay? Where's the ATP in this situation? Well, up here, okay, we're getting ATP out of it once we break down all those bonds in the glucose. Okay, here we're using energy to do stuff, okay? And we're going to show you how that works. All right, what does it mean to be a plant? This seems like a silly question, but seriously, what does it mean? We kind of know that because we've talked about the structural features of a plant cell versus an animal cell. We've talked about the cell walls and chloroplasts. But there's a little more detail we're going to get into about the anatomy of a plant. And we're going to be spending a unit on plants at the beginning of semester 2. Alright, so plants have to collect light energy. So they need structures that allow for light collection. Okay, we don't have structures for light collection in our body. Right, this is unique to plants. So they're gonna transform light energy into chemical energy. So they need structures that do that. So you've got to have some kind of way to take that light and make it into usable chemical energy. Then they have to be able to store light energy, okay, in a stable form to be moved around the plant or stored for later use. And that's what glucose is. Okay, it's a way to store energy from the sun. So plants have to get the building block atoms from the environment. And here are the building block elements that are required for plants. Okay, so it's a little more than just carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So where are plants going to get all of this? All right, so it's going to get CO2 from the atmosphere. All right, it's going to get water up through the roots. Right, so even though we see a lot of dew and water on plants, the mechanisms for drawing up water and using it in the plant are coming up through the roots. Okay, and there's some minerals in the water, okay, and there's some minerals in the soil. So they're going to have to take all these elements to produce all the organic molecules that they need to grow. And they're going to need to produce all the 4 types of organic molecules. So to reiterate, what's super important to understand from this slide is that first of all, a plant has to have the mechanisms for collecting and storing light energy. Secondly, a plant needs to get everything that it needs, all of these elements, which you do need to know that a plant requires all of these elements. It needs to find them all from the environment, and from the environment means that it's going to get carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, it's going to get water and some other elements out of rain and then into the soil and drawn up through the roots, and then other nutrients are going to be absorbed up the roots from the soil as well. And also to remember that a plant needs to produce all 4 types of organic molecules to survive. A plant requires all of this because, of course, it needs DNA, it needs to make lipids. For example, cucumbers have that waxy film on the outside, some of which is added by the grocery store, but some of it is naturally on cucumbers, which helps it retain water. So that's one example of how lipids are produced and used in a plant. Proteins, of course, which makes the stuff of plants, many of the structures, and tons of the little machinery inside a plant cell is proteins. And then, of course, carbohydrates, so necessary for the structure of a plant, as well as being able to use carbohydrates in cellular respiration to get ATP. So the plant isn't only making carbohydrates so that we can eat, the plant is making carbohydrates so that it can get ATP that it needs to do its job and to grow. So let's talk about the structure of a plant. So this picture is not in the chapter we're working on right now. It's in chapter 35. It's on page 713. Again, that's on page 713 is this exact figure. So it will be helpful right now to just kind of jump ahead to understand the basics of plant anatomy so that you kind of get how most plants work, even though we do this in much more detail coming up. But this helps you understand this idea of we're talking about how plants are going to get all the minerals that they need, all the elements that they're going to need to make what they need to make from the environment. There we go. So obtaining the raw materials. So sunlight. Where is sunlight being collected? One of the big misconceptions that I see with 9th graders when they're learning this and we're kind of drawing pictures about photosynthesis is that they'll draw a happy little flower and that they'll say that the petals on the flower are absorbing light. So they'll show like a little sun in the corner and the sun's rays going onto the flower. Well, that's not it. Okay, the flowers of plants are really not doing it. It's all about the leaves. So the leaves are the structure on a plant that's going to be able to collect light. Okay, and how are we going to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere? Where is that exchange going to occur? Well, that's going to occur at the stomates. Okay, so the stomates are in the leaf, and it's a structure we're going to look at in a couple minutes in more magnification, but that's in the leaf, and that's the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So it wouldn't make sense to have to try to harvest carbon dioxide, of course, from the roots or anything. We're going to take it right out of the atmosphere and utilize it that way. Why do we want to get carbon dioxide? Well, if we're going to make any organic molecules, and remember organic means carbon, we're going to need some carbon. So we're going to pluck carbon out of the atmosphere and turn it into organic molecules. Pretty cool. Water. we're going to uptake through the roots. Now you see here there is a degree of cellular respiration, or I mean respiration in general, occurring at the root level, but the majority of it is going to be in the leaves. So I shouldn't have said that it doesn't make sense to happen here, because a little bit of it does happen in the soil. My mistake there. And the hard part about these recordings is I can't go backwards. So we have to go as we go, otherwise I have to start all over, which is not going to happen. Okay, nutrients. All right, so nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, magnesium, iron, etc. are all going to be taken up in the roots. All right, so the bulk of our water and minerals are going to be coming up through the roots. We are going to have some water exchange in the leaf level, but the majority of it's going to come up the roots. We are going to have some oxygen-carbon exchange in the roots, but the majority of it's going to be in the leaves. And all the light energy input is going on into the leaves. Okay, and we can store a bunch of starch and sugar and seeds, okay, in a nice happy fruit. Right? We can also store starch and sugar in organs that exist in the root. So that's what a potato is, of course, but it looks like a potato. But other plants have other similar kinds of nodules too, to store sugar. Okay, moving on. All right. So here, this is a super important slide of all of these structures in a leaf that we're going to be talking about. This exact picture, I didn't see where it came from in the book, but this similar picture is on page 725. So this is the anatomy of a leaf, and so if you need to see it, you can see it on page 725. But this gives you kind of everything you need. You may want to, after you're done listening to this video, kind of come back to this one and pause and catch up on looking at the different structures of a leaf to help you know what's going on. The stomata is one of the big features we're going to talk about with photosynthesis, because it's the specialized cells that allow carbon dioxide to enter, and they also allow water vapor out. Okay, so gas exchange occurs here, and what we're trying to look at here is a little cross section of a leaf. So you might have thought, we kind of taught you what a plant cell looks like, but as you can see, just within a regular old leaf, we're talking about lots of different kinds of specialized cells in a small area. Okay, so you've probably heard the word epidermis as it refers to us and being skin, but plants have an epidermis. Okay, they have this an upper and a lower. And if you notice, the stomate being the singular and stomata being the plural. I find with the plants, the singular and plural gets real confusing, but you'll get the hang of it, as well as these other cells, guard cells, that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Okay, the stomata are on the bottom of a leaf. Okay, so that gas exchange is on the bottom of the leaf. Right, we'll talk about these other parts in a little bit. So, well, I think I'll return to this slide again at the end, which will make it easier after we go through a little bit more of the parts. Okay. Okay, so I didn't realize that I had a couple more parts here, but the main come away point here about the stomata is that it's a site of transpiration, which you've heard about. It's part of the water cycle, of course, and gas exchange. So this is where CO2 and oxygen are going to be exchanged, as well as allowing the water vapor to leave. Okay, so this picture is from our chapter 10, and well, not exactly, but pretty darn close on page 183. Okay, so we take a leaf and we go into a cross section of the leaf, and from there we're going to zoom in on a mesophyll cell. So for photosynthesis, the stomata and the mesophyll cells are super important. Okay, so the mesophyll cells are where most of the chloroplasts are. They're elsewhere in the leaf as well, but we're going to find the bulk of them in the mesophyll cells. Now, coming back to that singular plural deal, and I'll have to check this out, but the person who made this PowerPoint refers to the singular of stomata to be stomate, and your book says stoma, and I'm not sure who wins that argument. I have heard both. So to be consistent, well, I'll probably just remind you of both as we go. But your book does say stoma, so let's go with that. And I can check to see what the deal is with that. But anyway, so taking a leaf cross section, as I said, it makes more sense to come back to that big picture of leaf anatomy after we've kind of gone through things a little bit. But for our purposes right now, we're zooming in on a mesophyll cell, and the mesophyll cell is described on page 182, so that's where we are in the book. And now we're zooming in on one chloroplast, and this is what it looks like on electron microscope. Okay, so with an electron, at the electron level, there's no color. That's why these are always in black and white. But of course, since a plant, we'll talk about wavelengths in a little bit, but plants appear green because they reflect green light. So plants absorb a lot of the light spectrum but reflect back green, so they appear green. So here's our chloroplast, okay, and we're going to go through the structures inside the chloroplast in detail in a minute. So this is the structure that's responsible in a leaf for absorbing sunlight and carbon dioxide and producing sugar. All right, so as I said, the leaves, redundancy I know in these PowerPoints helps you, so that's why I say everything 2 or 3 times. So if you get it on the first run, good for you, but if not, I know a lot of you need things said a few times because you're more visual. So that's why I say it 3 times, not just to be annoying, but also to be annoying, sure. All right, then taking the cross-section of a leaf, finding those chloroplasts in the mesophyll cells. Okay, there's our chloroplast, which contains chlorophyll, which is, of course, green pigment. All right, and there's the sunlight and carbon dioxide going in, and that finishes that picture. All right, so we're going to talk about a little bit more of that. Chloroplasts. A typical mesophyll cell has 30 to 40 chloroplasts. So probably when we drew plant cells to talk about organelles, we put 1 chloroplast in there, but of course you need a bunch of them if you're going to be really effective. Just like we talked about how cells have a ton of mitochondria that do a lot of energy. If you're a plant cell doing a lot of photosynthesis, you're going to have a lot of chloroplasts. So they are somewhere around 2 to 4 microns wide by 4 to 7 microns long. So they have this like oval shape. So each chloroplast has 2 membranes. It has a double membrane, an inner and an outer. Okay, there's the outer and the inner membrane. You are responsible for the anatomy of a chloroplast. So at the end of this slide, I believe you should pause it and make sure that you can draw and label a chloroplast. All right, stroma. So here's what's confusing about this, that you're going to get confused between stoma and stroma. And if you can come up with a good trick to remember which is which, that would be awesome. So the difference is that the stroma is the gooey fluid interior of a chloroplast. So it's kind of like the chloroplast's cytosol. Right, so if you can somehow link cytosol with R to kind of help yourself remember it, I don't know. But I always found that hard to keep them straight when I was learning this material. So stoma is the specialized cell for gas exchange in a leaf, and stroma is the cytosol of the thylakoid. Of the chloroplast. So that's just kind of pointing to the interior. Okay, so it's got like gooey mush inside, and that gooey mush is where a couple key reactions take place, and we'll talk about that. So inside the nesting in the stroma are the thylakoid sacs, and so that's these green pancakes here. Okay, and they're little discs that are the perfect mechanism for receiving light. We'll talk about that in a second. And then when you have a whole bunch of them together, okay, they are called grana. So one stack will be called a granum, but a bunch of stacks will be grana. So the singular is granum and the plural is grana. See what I mean about how annoying this singular and plural are for this? Yeah. Yep, it's annoying. Go with it. Learn it. Love it. Okay. Thylakoid membranes contain chlorophyll. That's that green pigment. It's inside the thylakoid. Okay, and the thylakoid is a little membrane. Little pancake membrane. Okay, and it also has an electron transport chain. And luckily you already learned about electron transport chain, so that's part going to be easy. And guess what else is there? ATP synthase, our good friend. Okay, remember that little machine that loves a little concentration gradient of protons? So that's our friend ATP synthase. Remember how I said it existed in other membranes besides just the mitochondrial membranes? So here it is again. There, in the chloroplast, there's actually some little ribosomes as well, and some DNA. So chloroplast and thylakoid, right? And we get a whole bunch of buildup of proton gradient building up in the thylakoid sac, and that's going to work our little ATP synthase to get some ATP out of it. Yeehaw! Aren't you glad I shut the sounds off on hers? We didn't have to hear that explosion. I kind of miss it. Can't decide. Alright, so this is a super important slide with a lot of the anatomy on it. So I would like you to pause here and draw the chloroplast and the anatomy of a chloroplast. It is in your book on page 183, but I think you should practice drawing and labeling it because we definitely learn from drawing and labeling and not just looking at pictures. Okay, so photosynthesis. You'll notice that kind of like in our other chapter on cellular respiration, we had one of these pictures to kind of keep you oriented about where we are in the process. So this is one of those pictures we'll kind of come back to a bunch of times to see where we are, because it has multiple steps to it, just like cellular respiration, and the multiple steps take place in different parts. So you're going to have to know not every enzyme and every part of every reaction, but you're going to have to know what goes into each part of the reaction, what comes out, and where each major reaction occurs. So some of the reactions are dependent on light, and some of them are not. Not that light is required for photosynthesis, it's just that light is just going to be utilized in one part of the reaction. Right, so we have light reactions. Okay, we're talking about light-dependent reactions, meaning reactions that are not going to go forward unless there's light involved. Okay, obviously there's no photosynthesis without light, but you'll see what I'm talking about when we get to the other part of the reaction that happens after we've already done this conversion of light. All right, so energy conversion reactions. meaning we are converting solar energy to chemical energy. So we are taking photons of light and turning them into chemical energy that we can use, because organisms function in the language of chemistry, right? We're all dependent on all these molecules working, so we can't just straight up utilize light and go on with ourselves, right? It's not like, oh, I'm in the sun, I'm functioning. It's not quite like that, okay? So we've got to figure out a way to convert light and stuff from the atmosphere into chemical energy. All right, so we're going to take light, right? We're going to be talking about ATP and NADPH. What is NADPH for in this? Well, for the same thing that it was in cellular respiration. NADPH is an electron carrier. It's like money in the bank, right? It's holding on to a high energy electron that's going to be used for energy. So we're going to take light and convert it into some NADPH so that we have high energy electrons to drive the process of making sugars. Good so far? Okay. We're going to go through these in much more detail. This is just kind of the overview. It's going to take us a couple days to get through this. So I know a lot of you wrote me and said you really struggled with chapter 10 when you were doing the reading guides. So, we're going to hit all of that. Okay, so the Calvin cycle over here, our buddy Calvin, by that point, light's no longer a requirement. The light part already happened. Remember that all of photosynthesis is dependent on light, but we're going to use the light and convert it to chemical energy first, and then take the products of the light reactions to drive the Calvin cycle. So it's light independent. So they used to call them light and dark reactions, but it was super confusing because this happens during the day. So it's not like it's happening in the dark, but it was a kind of poor name. So we're spending a lot of time in these years kind of straightening all that out. So, but we're still doing this idea of distinguishing between light-dependent reactions and light-independent reactions. But even though it's light-independent, okay, it's happening during the day, and the whole process requires the sun to get going. Okay, so it's not the dark reactions. That used to be called that, confused everyone like crazy, so we changed it to be light independent reaction, and it's where we build sugar. Woohoo! Sugar! Alright, we're using chemical energy that we got from the light dependent reactions, so we got some ATP and NADPH to reduce carbon dioxide and synthesize sugar. Alright, so if you need to, this picture up here is on page 185. It'll keep yourself oriented as we move forward. Or if you want to jot down a couple quick notes about the purpose of light reaction and the purpose of the Calvin cycle. The purpose of the light-dependent reaction is to convert solar energy to chemical energy, and the chemical energy that we're getting is ATP and NADPH. Then we go to the Calvin cycle, and we're going to use that chemical energy to reduce carbon dioxide and make sugar. Good so far? Okay. So let's talk about light reactions first. Actually, this is a super long movie right now, so I'm going to call this part 1, Introduction to Photosynthesis, and then you'll start part 2.